right, I am scanning the crowd, and we got 1, 2, 3, 4, and we got 5, fabulous, 6, and 7. And now, Chris, you're gonna record this for me. So, am I on frame?
Action.
Alright, so we just watched the scene from Jaws where Robert Shaw plays Quint, the captain that is hired to catch the fish, the great white that's been terrorizing the Massachusetts beaches. And some of you are old enough to remember when Jaws came out. Some of you weren't born yet, but you've all seen that film. It came out in 1976. And it literally made people afraid to go in the water, even fresh water. I know I was. I was 13 when that movie came out. But that movie launched Steven Spielberg's career. And it also, the speech that we watched about where Robert Shaw played Quint, immortalized the saga of the USS Indianapolis. And millions of people did not know about the USS Indianapolis until they saw Jaws. And that included Steven Spielberg, who had never heard of it until during the shooting they decided to write in the Quint's speech to kind of explain why he became the man that he was. And that's when Spielberg became familiar with the story, and the rest is history. But what part of Quint's speech was fact and which part was fiction? And we're going to talk about that. Now, Quint said the ship went down on by two Japanese torpedoes on June 29, 1945, and it was carrying the parts of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. Now, they got the month wrong. They were off by about a month there. For some reason, they didn't catch the air. Quint said June 29th, 1945. It was actually July 30th, 1945, and a couple minutes right after midnight, the ship was torpedoed and hit by two torpedoes, one in the front of the ship, the bow, and the other one right around the middle. And it sank in 12 minutes. At 14 minutes past midnight, the ship went down, and now and it had just delivered the parts. It was coming back from delivering the parts of the Hiroshima bomb, which was nicknamed Little Boy. And it also had half the uranium that the United States had, half the enriched uranium. And so they did accomplish the mission, but coming back again, they were torpedoed. Now, Quint said that the mission was so secret that no distress signal had been sent, and they weren't listed as overdue for a week. Now, actually, being listed overdue for a week is also a script error. The last group was rescued after 4.5 days at sea, so it didn't last a week. And in fact, they were listed as overdue the next day. But what was going on is so many ships were being rerouted at the time because there was a typhoon that was hitting northern Japan at the moment, and also the armed forces were preparing for a massive land invasion in case Japan didn't surrender after the bombs were dropped, which thankfully they did. But that's what was going on, and there was thousands of ships being rerouted in the last few months. And when they saw that the USS Indianapolis was overdue, they just assumed that it was being rerouted, and they had no cause to think otherwise, except that there was a distress signal sent. And it was actually picked up by 3 of the naval stations, operation stations out there. 2 of them, and obviously this was just past midnight, because that's when the ship was hit by the torpedoes and sent the signals out. 2 of these operation bases tried to have contact, and they sent a message back to the Indianapolis, but they didn't receive a reply because it sunk so fast. But because they didn't receive a reply, they disregarded it because it was standard practice for the Japanese at the time to send out false SOS signals to try to draw ships out there in a rescue effort, so then they could attack them. And so that's why the two of them disregarded it. Another one actually scrambled two rescue vessels, and they were 21 hours away, and they were 7 hours into the voyage to come and appear at the scene to rescue these men. And when the Commodore found out that these two vessels were scrambled without him being notified first, he was displeased with it, and he called them back even though they were already 7 hours into the 21-hour journey. So that was another missed opportunity right there. And so they were actually, distress signals, and it was they were listed as overdue, but just one blunder after another left these men in the water, and the minutes and hours and days were piling up. And Quint said that 1,100 men went into the water, and 300 came out alive. Now, the crew list had 1,196 men, and 300 of them were estimated to have been killed when the torpedoes hit and the ensuing explosions that happened afterwards. And so about 900 men went into the water, and about half of them were able to grab some life jackets and inflatables. And there were even one group of men was able to grab 5 floater nets and 4 rafts as well. So they were in a little bit better shape than the other guys that were going in there, either with nothing or just the life vest. And these men were drenched in oil, as well as the flotation devices. And what happened was oil began to leak into the seams. And after a few days at sea, these life vests and inflatables were pretty much useless as it became waterlogged and began to lose their buoyancy. So, Quint alluded to the sharks getting the men, and they estimated about 200 of the men were killed by sharks there, and another 400 died from other causes. Men were drowning, there was hypothermia going on, and dehydration, photophobia from just getting blasted by the sun out there unrelentingly for days at a time. And some men just simply couldn't take it anymore, and they were drinking the salt water, and then that hastened their demise, and so there was drownings, and men simply just committed suicide and couldn't take it any longer, and would just take their vest off and drown, or even let the sharks attack them. They would swim to the sharks just so they would be attacked and their suffering would be over. Now, half the guys went in there with no flotation devices, and what they did was they were swimming around waiting to grab one from some of the other men that died. So that's what was going on. And Quint mentioned Herbie Robinson, a ball player of his from Cleveland that was a friend of his that he bobbed up and down after he shook him to wake him up. Well, he's fictitious. That is a fictitious character. I checked the crew list, and there was no Herbie Robinson on it, except, though, that injuries such as being bitten in half were definitely sustained by these men out there. So the injuries that he sustained were factual, although the character himself, Herbie Robinson, was fictional. Now, Quint said he was rescued after 4.5 days after they were torpedoed by a young pilot who spotted them. Now, that young pilot was named Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn, and he was in a Lockheed Ventura, 24-year-old young man, and he was given his briefing that morning at 5 a.m., and this was 2.5 days after the sinking, and he was given his briefing to go patrol the area that they had known submarine activity at, in that shipping lane. And so he's going about 3,000 feet, and his plane is armed with explosives, depth charges to attack submarines when he sees them. And he saw an oil slick, so he swung down in to check it out, and about 900 feet, he followed it for about 5 miles, and then he thought he saw something in the water. He got down to 300 feet, and that's when he saw 30 men in the water who were frantically waving for help to him, and he did a maneuver, flapped his wing, the wing device there, and signaled to them that he had seen them. So the men knew that they were going to begin rescue soon, and hours after that, they began the rescue effort. And the last survivors were actually pulled from the water 4.5 days later. It was a group of 5, and they had drifted 124 miles from where the actual sinking took place.
Wow.
And 124, they were drifting about a mile a minute on the average, and this was a group of 5 men. And that's when Quint said he was pulled out of the water 4.5 days later, and that would put him in the last group. But the 321 men came out of the water. 4 died in the hospital soon afterwards. So you had 317 actual survivors from the 1,196 original crew member. And then a few days later, on August 6th, 1945, a little boy was dropped, and the assembly crew wrote on the side of this first atomic bomb, they wrote, "This is for the boys of the Indianapolis." And that bomb hit Hiroshima, killed over 100,000 people, and the epicenter reached temperatures of over 1 million degrees and generated winds of 500 miles per hour, if you can imagine that. Now, the story didn't end there. The survivors, as you can imagine, struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, which they didn't even know what it was back then. But at the beckoning of one of the psychiatrists of one of these men, they started up a reunion in 1960. And it was attended by 200 men. And the reunion, they've gone on now. There's one scheduled in early July this year. And last year, 14 of the 31 survivors made. We have a picture of that. And it's a picture of the survivors that were at last year's meeting right there. And here's a picture, one of the survivors when he was pulled onto the boat. And you can see they're drenched in oil. This young man had a leg injury. And it was as bad as it got out there. But that's the story of the crew. Now the captain, his ordeal didn't stop with the end of the war. Captain Charles McVeigh became the first commander of a boat or a vessel that was lost in an attack to ever be court-martialed. And in December of 1945, he was actually court-martialed because he lost the vessel, and they were looking for a scapegoat to use on him and to blame the disaster on. And their star witness was the Japanese commander of the sub that actually sunk the SS Indianapolis. They flew him in from Japan, and he appeared at the courts martialed, and he was extremely uncomfortable. But they asked him if Captain McVeigh had used the evasive maneuvers, which in that day was the zigzag in submarine infested waters, and the Japanese captain confirmed that they did not zigzag. However, it wouldn't have made any difference anyway. And but he was found guilty of not taking evasive action, and he lost his commission. They relegated him to an office job in New Orleans and finished out his career. Never commanded a boat again. And then, unfortunately, Captain McVeigh was receiving hate mail after the incident. And especially around Thanksgiving and Christmas, he would receive letters from the families saying, for instance, if it wasn't for you, we'd have our husband here, or the father of our children would be here with us. And it took its toll on him. And he was often seen by his family crying after receiving these letters. And Captain McVeigh committed suicide in November 1968. So, now you know the facts of the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. And thanks to Jaws, millions of Americans now know of the courage and bravery of the crew that was immortalized by Quint in this unforgettable scene in Jaws. Thank you so much.
Thank you.